Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kate Cagney, the Director of the Institute for Social Research, and I'm so glad you could join us in this room today for the ISR Insights Speaker Series, and I'm thrilled to see this full room. I do want to say a little bit about our Insight Speaker Series. It's our way of sharing, I think, the innovative work of our community, our faculty here, and to understanding, right, our fundamental contributions to social science. With over 300 affiliated faculty, it turns out to be 344 exactly, which I just learned later. ISR research spans an incredible range of topics from wealth inequality, racial justice, to political opinion, aging, and health. You can find the full schedule of upcoming Insights talks, recording of past talks, in case you want to share these with your colleagues, on our website at isrumich.edu. So today's talk will be recorded and posted there as well, so you can revisit and again share with your colleagues. So today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Brady West. Brady is research professor in ISR Survey Research Center and in the university's Department of Biostatistics. He is an associate director of the Health and Retirement Study, and he is an MPI with Sung-Hee Lee of the Network for Innovative Methods in Longitudinal Aging Studies, NIMLAS. His current research focuses on some of the most pressing challenges in modern survey methodology, especially how we can improve the accuracy and reliability of survey data. So today, Brady will present results from his ongoing work on alternatives to the simple response rate, attempting to understand non-response bias associated with a given survey estimate. And so one reason this room is packed is because I think we're all experiencing, right, what declining response rates mean. We want a better understanding. Brady will show us that there are alternatives for understanding whether estimates based on survey with a low response rate are really subject to non-response bias. So this is so essential to the way that we are characterizing the results from the data we collect. So I'm thrilled Brady's here. He has assured me that you can shout out with questions at any point, and so we should treat this sort of in a conversational manner. We're glad he's open to that and so happy that he will be here enlightening us. So thank you so much, Brady. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Really happy, like Kate said, to see the full room. Thank you, Kate, for the nice introduction. And I definitely want to thank the ISR Insights group for the invitation today. So I'm really happy to be able to present. I especially want to thank the Future of Surveys subcommittee that was working on response rates versus data quality. That's where a lot of these discussions really came to the forefront. And we'll be giving actually an SRC seminar presentation talking about how a lot of the elements that I'm describing and introducing today, we view those as potentially being part of an SRC data quality profile for surveys that SRC produces. So, but that's coming up on the 30th where you can hear more about that. So again, thank you for being here. I have my email on the front of this slide. So if you have any questions, thoughts, comments that you didn't want to bring out today, but you'd like to send me a note or some thoughts and feedback, I'll be more than happy to hear from you. Again, this is ongoing work. We have a standing committee now that's going to keep working on this kind of stuff. And I would love to hear from you if you have additional thoughts or reflections based on your own projects. Okay, so just by way of an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I want to introduce non-response bias in general. I want to talk about the association between response rates and non-response bias in survey estimates. We'll talk about how we can attack non-response bias by design, which is always ideal, and then how we can measure non-response bias aside from simply reporting response rates. That's really the big idea today is what do we have as alternatives in our toolbox to simply reporting the response rate for a given survey if we're trying to describe potential non-response bias. And then I'll end with some concluding thoughts on this important problem. I want to try to finish up by about 12:45 so that we'll have time for Q&A, but like Kate said, if anything sounds completely absurd to you and you just want to yell at me, just feel free to speak out and be more than happy to take that criticism, okay? Okay, so let's start with a definition of non-response bias. There's a couple different ways to think about this. One is a so-called deterministic definition of non-response bias, and that says the bias in an estimate of a mean based on respondents, that's what the little R stands for there, can be written as a non-response rate, so the number of people in some population that would not respond to a survey request, divided by the total size of that population, multiplied by the difference between the mean for people who would respond and the mean for people who would not respond. And that's something that a lot of people forget about when talking about non-response bias. This is not just a function of an overall response or non-response rate, but it's a function of the difference between respondents and non-respondents in terms of what they would say in the survey. This is a deterministic definition of non-response bias because it assumes that everybody in the population is either going to be a respondent or a non-respondent all the time. So if you were to survey or ask somebody to participate in a survey over and over again, like me, I'd probably already respond. If you talk to my mom, she's going to hang the phone up on you every time you call her. Okay? We're very different people, but that's not going to change across different hypothetical replications of that invitation. Okay? Unfortunately, in this definition, the mean for people who would never ever respond is of course not observed because they never ever respond. So this is a theoretical definition of non-response bias, but it illuminates where that bias comes from. So the question, this deterministic perspective, is when is that difference between the mean for respondents and non-respondents large? That symbol didn't show up here, but that's a couple greater than signs. That says when is that absolute value largest, and how can we detect that, and how can we address that by design? An alternative, more modern way of thinking about non-response bias, I think, is to think of it as a stochastic phenomenon, where that bias can roughly be written as the covariance between the Y variable of interest and a person's propensity to respond divided by the average response propensity in the survey that we're trying to conduct. That says response propensity is a stochastic thing. One day, I might be feeling great, might be feeling like I want to donate my time. I say, sure, I'll respond to your survey. The next day, I'm having a really bad day. I've had 5 phone calls in a row, and I don't want to have anything to do with your survey. It changes from one possible ask to the next. And the non-response bias can be written as the covariance between the variable that we're trying to measure and my propensity to respond at that particular invitation. So non-response bias is going to be large under this setting, the stochastic setting, when that covariance, or you can just think of it as the correlation between Y and response propensity is also large. So key feature in both of these definitions is the variable of interest and how that variable of interest differs between respondents and non-respondents. We cannot just think of the response rate by itself as a driver of non-response bias. Okay? So Bob Groves in this 2006 paper in POQ laid out a number of different potential mechanisms that could lead to non-response bias. These are 5 different models that he brought forth. The first is a separate causes model where we have different variables influencing response propensity P and survey variables of interest Y. So in that particular case, there's not necessarily a connection between response propensity and Y. Remember, we need that correlation to have evidence of non-response bias. A very popular model that a lot of people use to support the idea of non-response bias is the so-called common cause model, where there's some auxiliary information, Z, that simultaneously predicts both response propensity and the variable of interest Y, and that introduces that covariance between P and Y that can lead to non-response bias. And that's often looked at as a model that can be used to inform design strategies for addressing non-response bias. What are those Zs that we can address by design to try to break that covariance between P and Y? Okay? Make sure that Z doesn't any longer predict P or Z doesn't any longer predict Y and get rid of that covariance. A very challenging model, if this is operating in practice, is where the survey variable of interest directly predicts response propensity. Okay? So basically, no matter what we try to do using other auxiliary variables or targeting other information, the variable that we're actually trying to measure is a key predictor of response propensity. Okay? And that leads to what are so-called non-ignorable mechanisms of non-response, where no matter what other information we have, the people who are more likely to respond tend to have different values on the variable of interest Y. And we need more advanced strategies for dealing with that. I'll talk about some of those as we go forward. And then there are some other models as well that incorporate measurement error and various types of non-response error. But again, key to all of these mechanisms is the relationship between Y and P and how the relationship between Y and P may come about depending on our design or the measures that we're trying to collect. Okay, so this is just a couple examples of what might come up, for example, in the separate causes model. We might try to call people on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, but those people are only home Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So our strategy by design and pair data about when we call is predictive of whether or not they're going to respond. That's just an example of design approaches we can take. And then we might have a substantive relationship of interest where whether or not that X that we're interested in predicting Y with also predicts P could be a key factor in whether or not we have non-response bias. In that separate causes model, X has nothing to do with P. Okay, so we have to think about what introduces that covariance between P. Now, in the late 2000s, there was a lot of empirical work initiated by Bob Groves and some of his students at the time. Amelia Pecheva was a PhD student at the time here at Michigan, when they wrote this highly influential article that presented a meta-analysis of estimates of non-response bias for many different key estimates. So this picture that you're seeing here, each dot is the non-response bias associated with a given survey estimate from a survey, okay? It's not a quantity associated with an overall survey. That's another key takeaway point from today. Non-response bias is not a feature of a survey. Non-response bias is a feature of an estimate produced by a survey. And that's what this graph is showing. You see a bunch of straight lines, okay, coming up from the bottom. Those are all estimates that are coming from a given survey, okay? So on the x-axis, you see the non-response rate for that particular survey, and that's why there are so many estimates grouped in a straight line moving up. Okay, for a given survey with a given non-response rate, which again is a feature of a survey, there are a number of estimates produced by that survey, and not all estimates are going to have the same amount of non-response bias. Okay, that's the message in this graph. The other main message in this graph is that there is very little association between the non-response rate and the amount of non-response bias in a given estimate. Okay, so this notion that as the response rate goes up, the non-response bias necessarily goes down is essentially a fallacy. Okay, we cannot operate that way with our thinking. So similarly, as we're all seeing response rates go down, although I'm happy to report that the panel response rate for HRS just went up in the last wave. Although these response rates are tending to go down, we can't automatically connect those decreasing response rates with non-response bias in our estimates. You can even see within any given survey, no matter what the non-response rate is, the amount of actual bias in that estimate is all over the map on that scale of 0 to 100 in terms of relative bias, okay? So there's a very weak connection. A couple years later, a couple of our colleagues said, well, we'd like to reanalyze those data, okay? Put a little bit more weight on some of the estimates that were produced by some of these studies. They took a second look at the data. In this graph, you can see the response rate on the x-axis and then the mean absolute relative bias on the y-axis. So Brick and Tarango said if you put a little bit more weight on studies that had larger sample sizes and so forth, maybe there is a weak relationship, whereas response rate goes up, it seems like the non-response bias might increase a little bit, or may decrease a little bit, I should say, based on this graph. But still, that relationship itself is very weak. And you can see, even for some studies with high response rates, even with the different weighting approach that they used, there's still evidence of non-response bias. So you could have an 85% response rate for your survey, and you're still going to have non-response bias in some of your estimates. Why? Because it's all about the difference between the respondents and the non-respondents in terms of what you're trying to measure. So even if you have an exceptionally large response rate, your estimates could still be subject to bias, depending on what you're trying to measure. So this relationship has now been shown over and over and over again to be very weak. And we can't say that a low response rate automatically implies non-response bias in the estimates that we're computing. Okay, so of course, we want to think about how can we reduce non-response bias. Large changes in the response rate are one way to potentially impact bias. Again, there's not a deterministic link. We've shown that that relationship is very weak. So sure, you can dedicate resources to trying to increase the response rate. That's going to give you more yield. It's going to reduce your standard errors, but it's not guaranteed to reduce your non-response bias. Okay, so in some cases, focusing only on the non-response rate could be very misdirected, depending on the variables that you're trying to measure. Another approach is to identify the mechanisms that produce the bias and try to undercut those mechanisms. So again, going back to that common cause model, if we can identify auxiliary variables that are related to both response propensity and the key variable of interest, and then try to break those associations, eliminate the association between Z and P, or eliminate the association between Z and Y, we can get rid of that covariance between P and Y. So we might, by design, try to use different strategies for certain types of people defined by Z to eliminate that higher propensity to respond for certain kinds of people. Or we might try to target people with certain predicted values on the variable of interest Y, trying to eliminate that association between Z and Y. We want to break that covariance so that the numerator in that stochastic definition is as close to 0 as possible. And if we can do that by design, by targeting or making good use of that auxiliary information Z, that's an ideal situation. Okay, so we certainly want to try to do that, and I'll come back to that idea. Some mechanisms just don't matter for non-response bias, like we talked about Groves's separate causes model. In that case, there's nothing introducing an association between P and Y. Okay, so that it wouldn't help us to act on Z or to act on X. It's all about what introduces that association between P and Y. And we also have to recognize that the samples that we're working with, especially nowadays, are very heterogeneous. We can't pretend that one survey data collection protocol is going to work equally well for all the people that we're trying to work with in our surveys. We have to try different strategies for different types of people. One size definitely does not fit all, and that's generally going to help us with non-response bias. Okay? An important thought or an important theory, if you ask Bob, he argues that this should not be a theory. It was more of an idea that they scratched out on paper, but over the years it's become known as leverage salience theory, is the idea that different aspects of a survey data collection have different amounts of leverage for different people. Okay, so you can think about the burden associated with a given survey request, the amount of the incentive, the authority of the sponsor, the topic of a particular survey. These different pictures, you can think of these as being two different people, okay? And these different aspects of the survey have completely different leverage for those different individuals. So you can see, for example, person number 2, topic is all the way to the left. And if we can think of being on the left as not responding and being on the right as responding, if that topic gets too much emphasis for person number 2, they're not going to respond. That lever is going to fall all the way down to the left, and they're going to side on the side of not responding. Okay, but for person number 2, if you really give them a lot of money, that's going to pull that lever down to the right and put them more on the side of actually responding. So that's the leverage. The idea that these different parts of a survey may have different leverage for different people. Now, how do we make these things tip? With the emphasis that we put on each of these different features. Okay. So for person number 1, they were really interested in the topic. Okay, those bubbles or those balls that you see in this picture, that's the salience. That's the amount of emphasis given to that particular feature of the survey for that particular person. So topic was all the way out on the right. So for person number 1, if we really emphasize the topic of the survey and the sponsor, that's going to tip them in the direction of responding if we put more weight on those particular features. Whereas again, with person number 2, if we put too much emphasis on the topic, they're more unlikely to respond. We got to put more emphasis on the incentive and potentially on the sponsor. The point here is the heterogeneity. Okay? Everybody in the populations that we're trying to study, these things matter differently to different people. And it's a difficult job to try to figure out which of these things will matter most for a particular person. That's where your friendly local survey methodologists and all of our wonderful graduate students are really hard at work, trying to figure out these kinds of adaptive and responsive survey designs that can pick out these features of a survey that really matter most for different people. We simply can't use a one-size-fits-all approach, again, keeping this leverage salience theory in mind. Okay, so just to summarize some of these kind of big picture ideas about non-response bias, remember that response rate is only part of the equation. We cannot equate response rates with non-response bias in individual survey estimates. Non-response bias in an estimate is a product of the response rate and the differences between the responders and the non-responders on that variable of interest. Okay? Even within a given survey, We could have one estimate with a bunch of non-response bias and another estimate that looks perfect and is not subject to non-response bias at all. That's our mindset that we have to take when thinking about these issues, okay? It's difficult nowadays to make large changes in the response rate. I mentioned that the HRS response rate went up last panel wave. It went up by 1.3 percentage points, okay? This notion that some magic bullet is going to increase a response rate by 10, 15, 20 percentage points is just not a reality, okay? It's a very challenging task to make large changes in response rates. So that's important to recognize. The question is, by design or via analysis, can we weaken any of the relevant mechanisms that lead to non-response bias? This is where we have a need for indirect indicators of non-response bias, and that's what I'm going to be talking about as part of this talk here. There's really not one answer to that question of how we can weaken these mechanisms. Some mechanisms vary depending on the context. I showed you those different models. There may be different models operating for different variables in the same survey, okay? So it's a very challenging problem. And again, the samples that we're working with are very heterogeneous. Different mechanisms, different leverages of these different survey features across each of the different samples that we're working with. So we have to recognize that with our design strategies. Okay, so I want to now turn to some of these alternative measures of non-response bias in light of this kind of broad conceptual overview that I'm presenting right now. And I'm going to talk about several different ways to potentially quantify non-response bias, right? The ideal situation is where we know the values on the variable of interest for the people who didn't respond. We can compute a measure of the non-response bias directly. But in practice, we usually are not going to have that kind of information. So we need to think about these different possible measures to see how big of a problem non-response bias might be. So measure number one, the response rate. Generally, the response rate is written as the number of respondents to the survey divided by the number of eligible sample members based on the sample that we selected. The American Association for Public Opinion Research maintains many different standardized flavors of response rates, and that hyperlink is available in these slides. If you get access to these slides, it'll take you to the APOR website where they walk through all these different calculations. And they now have a lot of very nice online calculators using the disposition information from a given survey that will calculate a variety of response rates for you. You can see their different roles and their different purposes, depending on the context. But as I noted earlier, empirical evidence largely suggests that response rates have very weak associations with the non-response bias in estimates. I've listed a number of these articles here. There's also a nice article by Dan Hedlund at Stockholm University in Sweden, where he talks about this notion of a safe space where regardless of the non-response mechanism, non-response bias tends to be pretty unlikely. The safe space being in terms of your response rates. That's the picture on this slide here. This is taken directly from that Hedlund article in 2020. I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It offers a very nice perspective on this problem relating response rates to non-response bias. You see on the x-axis the mean response propensity for a given survey, and then you see on the y-axis the relative bias in a given estimate. The different lines are different non-response mechanisms that are potentially leading to that bias. Don't worry about the numbers that are on those lines. Hedlund's point in this article was that when you get to a response rate of about 0.3, you're in this window where more or less, regardless of the mechanism, the relative bias in your estimates tends to be pretty small. And that's what he studied empirically and theoretically in that particular article, and said, people are up in arms about not hitting 70 and 80% response rates, but if you look at it closely, getting about a 30% response rate really reduces that risk of non-response bias, okay? So very, very important article that, again, coming out of Sweden, not a lot of people are fully aware of this, but definitely worth taking a look at in this regard. So I mentioned that paper by Brick and Taranjo, revisiting the earlier studies, looking at that association between response rates and non-response bias. And they suggest that while yes, that correlation with non-response bias may be weak, increasing response rates using responsive and/or adaptive design strategies is always going to be helpful in theory. These are strategies, I'll come back to them in a little bit, but they're strategies that recognize the heterogeneity in the samples that we're working with. And we try to adapt our protocols or modify our protocols to be more adaptive and responsive to what we learn about the people that we're working with. What we've picked up trying to get them to participate in the survey, we modify our protocols to be more responsive to what we've learned about those individuals, okay? That's always gonna be helpful in theory by design. We wanna try to do what we can by design so that we don't have to worry about eventual adjustment after the fact and trying to deal with the non-response bias after the fact. There's a program also in the UK called Survey Futures. I've included a hyperlink here. They've been doing a lot of work over the past couple of years about thinking about the future of survey data collection and how we need to operate differently in the current survey research environment. This is a direct verbatim statement from their recommendations based on what they've learned and what they've been compiling over these last couple of years. They say response rates are not a reliable indicator of non-response bias, and even less so of overall survey quality. So even if we go above and beyond the non-response bias in a given survey estimate, it's an even worse idea to automatically label a survey as being bad because it has a response rate of X. Okay, that's the message that they're really trying to get across. So response rates are good for standardized reporting of yield. Again, APOR spent a lot of time determining these standardized response rates, but they're really not good for trying to determine the quality of a given survey. That's a very important takeaway here. So an important open question, if we're working with a probability sample with a very low response rate, is that any different from a non-probability sample, where there's a lot of self-selection into that non-probability sample that we don't control? So if I give you a probability sample with a 5% response rate, should we think of that as a non-probability sample? Or does it still have some positive features of a probability sample? There's also been a lot of empirical work in this area suggesting that probability sampling, even with low response rates, does offer advantages and benefits over purely non-probability samples where we have no idea who's self-selecting into that particular sample. But ultimately, this depends on the amount of selection bias that's associated with estimates based on your selected sample. And this is where some of the more principled model-based indicators that I'm going to be talking about have value in trying to quantify that selection bias. Furthermore, with probability samples, we can differentiate between selection bias that's due to sampling and selection bias that's due to non-response. We can peel apart those two pieces and try to understand where the selection bias is coming from. With non-probability samples, all we can do is estimate overall selection bias. We can't really determine if it's coming from the sampling or the non-response. So that's another advantage of probability sampling. Okay, so that's about response rates. Another very important measure of potential non-response bias is variation in subgroup response rates. So this is where there's a general family of indicators called the R indicators. These were originally developed by Barry Schouten in the Netherlands and his colleagues and students. They've written many papers on these R indicators. These R indicators reflect variation in estimated response propensities across the different cases in a sample. That's at the core of what they're really measuring. How variable is the response propensity across all the different cases in a given sample? And these estimated response propensities are computed based on fully observed auxiliary variables. Okay, so we can calculate those based on models for our response indicator using those observed auxiliary variables. The basic idea of the R indicators is that the higher the R indicator, where a 1 is perfect, the less variation in the estimated response propensities and the more quote unquote representative and balanced the sample is in terms of whatever auxiliary variables were used to estimate response propensity. So there's nothing to stop you from estimating response propensity using a single auxiliary variable and calculating these R indicators, okay? What they're indicating is only as good as the auxiliary variables that were used to compute those R indicators, okay? So you have to scrutinize the models that were used to predict response propensity in these cases. So the R indicators are nice in that they follow a model-based approach, but the R indicators assume that the non-response is ignorable. That is, once we condition on those fully observed auxiliary variables, there's nothing else operating in terms of predicting response propensity. So the variables that we're actually trying to measure don't really matter once we condition on those auxiliary variables. So that's a huge assumption of these R indicators. And that's where a more recent body of research allowing for non-ignorable non-response has received some recognition relative to the use of these R indicators. Okay, so that's an important point to recognize about the R indicators, but they're still very useful in practice to quantify sample balance. Okay? So related to the R indicator is the simple idea of monitoring the variability among subgroups in response rates. And then during the data collection, shifting your resources to the subgroups that are lagging behind. So if you can constantly monitor the variability among these key subgroups, you can get a sense of where more resources might be needed and trying to make those response rates more stable across those subgroups. Another related indicator is calculating the coefficient of variation of those subgroup response rates. So you define key subgroups for your data collection. You look at response rates within each of those subgroups. You calculate the coefficient of variation of those subgroup response rates, and then you monitor that as the data collection proceeds, trying to minimize that coefficient of variation. So this responsive survey design idea of monitoring variation in subgroup response rates is really effective for reducing non-response bias as long as those auxiliary variables are predictive of key survey variables. If you're monitoring subgroup variation based on auxiliary variables that have nothing at all to do with the variables that you're trying to measure, this will do absolutely nothing for you. Again, because it all goes back to that covariance between Y and P. If you're unable to target good predictors of Y, simply monitoring response rate variation among groups defined by something that doesn't predict Y is going to do nothing. Okay? That's another key place where people fall short, is failing to look at auxiliary variables that predict the Y variables of interest when you define these subgroups. Okay, so that's another key part of this overall approach. So this is just an example from back when we were working on the National Survey of Family Growth here at ISR. So if you take a look at this picture, this is variability among subgroups defined by socio-demographic variables, so race, ethnicity, sex, and age, in terms of their response rates as a data collection period proceeded. And the point of this picture is you can see that thick black line, that particular subgroup, which tended to be older male Hispanics in this particular data collection period, they were really lagging behind all of the other subgroups as the days were proceeding in terms of their response rate. And as part of the NSFG, we were regularly monitoring this variability in these response rates because these socio-demographic groups varied significantly in terms of a lot of things we were trying to measure in the NSFG. So the fact that one of them was lagging behind for several days in a row said, we need to intervene in some way. More resources were dedicated to that particular subgroup about where you see the red box in the overall picture. And that shifting of attention and resources to that subgroup resulted in that sudden shift in their response rate, bringing them back up into the mixture with the remainder of the other socio-demographic subgroups. And for the remainder of that data collection period, you can see that there was stability in terms of the variability in those subgroup response rates. That's going to help the survey estimates that the NSFG was producing at the time, because we're not going to have underrepresentation from that older male Hispanic subgroup that may be very different in terms of the key measures that we were trying to collect. So that's what I mean by monitoring this subgroup variation as we go. And again, these are all related. R indicators, coefficient of variation of the subgroup response rates, looking at this visually every day really helps to identify where there could be potential non-response bias. But consider the other point of view. If you were to fit a model to key NSFG variables and race, ethnicity, age, and sex had nothing to do with those key variables, they didn't interact, they didn't have main effects, this entire exercise on this slide would be utterly pointless. Okay, that's the message that I want to get across here. Okay, another important approach for thinking about non-response bias is referencing external data or benchmarks. So if benchmark estimates are available to you for harmonized measures from other large probability-based surveys coming from the same population, simply compare the estimates that are being computed based on your survey to those other benchmark estimates. Does it seem like there are notable deviations from what other surveys of the same population would suggest? So the HRS is currently doing this. The hyperlink that you have on this slide is leading to the HRS website to show an official document that HRS has prepared, comparing estimates based on its core sample with those from the ACS, the CPS, and the NHIS, all based on harmonized measures. Those surveys are all collecting the same things. How comparable are those estimates, and do they overlap with each other? So that's an example of that particular strategy. You can also see work that Yajwan C., my colleague in SMP, and other colleagues have been doing on non-response bias analysis, where they're doing a full kind of profile analysis of potential non-response bias using references to external data and benchmarks as one potential part of that overall NRBA. So that's another good article to take a look at to see the kind of comprehensive approaches that can be used to do a full non-response bias analysis for a given survey. But referencing external data, harmonized data that have been collected on the same measures from the same population is a very valuable tool for trying to get a sense of this. Okay, a fourth important tool is non-response follow-up. This is more of a qualitative approach to thinking about non-response bias and how we might attack it. So using the theory and the ideas of responsive survey design, the idea is to follow up with non-respondents in a second or later phase of data collection. So Steve Heeringa's here today. He and Bob Groves wrote a very influential article about the idea of responsive survey design and how you can apply that in practice for a given data collection. But there are different ways we can go about doing this. In those later phases of data collection where you have a sense of people who are difficult or who haven't yet responded, you can significantly modify the data collection protocol, okay? Change your strategy for addressing those individuals. Possibly you can increase your incentives. This is something that a lot of surveys are trying right now, these kinds of so-called end game strategies, like we're gonna reach out to you one more time. If you do the survey, we'll increase the amount of incentive you can get by $50 or whatever the case may be. That's our last chance, we'll stop bugging you. It works. It works in practice, okay? Trying different modes of data collection, trying different approaches with the modes that you're already using, like using different language in your letters, using different approaches on the telephone, tailoring your invitations to these non-respondents based on what you've learned from the initial contact effort, okay? Changing it up in practice. Don Dillman, who just passed away, was a leading proponent of these kinds of ideas. You just can't do the same thing over and over and over again. We got to change up what we're doing based on what we've learned, okay? Depending on your resources available to you, maybe take a subsample of the non-respondents and dedicate more resources in later phases to that subsample. The NSFG did this every single data collection quarter and did it in a very cost-efficient fashion. You might say, well, you're taking a subsample. You're not trying to follow up with all the non-respondents. The information that you bring in a much more efficient fashion pays for itself, okay? So that's a very important strategy as well. You need to adjust weights or adjust for mode effects in your analysis. Again, this is something that's done more post hoc after the responsive survey design is implemented. And the key overall message is documentation. Documentation, documentation, documentation. If you try something, any of these different procedures as a type of non-response follow-up, make sure that your survey program documents it so that others can learn from it and your survey can learn from it in the future. Okay, so you can try that again in the future, see if it still works. Okay, so any non-response follow-up definitely has to be documented in these types of approaches. The fraction of missing information is another very important quantitative tool. James Wagner wrote a 2010 article in POQ kind of focusing on FMI and what it can offer. This is another promising alternative to response rates. It gives you an estimate of how much information remains missing on a given variable, again, focusing on estimates that are produced based on individual variables, after you leverage the information in other variables to make predictions of what those values should have been. So based on the other variables that you have available to you in the data set, how much information can you recover in terms of what's currently missing in the variables of interest? So it's more of an issue related to item non-response in this context. The fraction of the FMI is a byproduct of standard multiple imputation procedures. So if you conduct multiple imputation of the missing values in a given data set, you can automatically compute the FMI. And that's a nice alternative to just, again, reporting the overall survey response rate. You can talk about the missing data rate for a given variable, accounting for the people who didn't respond, and then say, what does that FMI look like after I try to impute those missing values? Okay, how much information am I recovering? So it's useful to compare missing data rates on a given variable of interest prior to imputation to FMI values after the imputation for those individual variables. See if the imputation recovered some of the information that was originally missing. So you have a 50% response rate to a survey. You know right away that you're going to be missing 50% of the values on a variable of interest. An additional 10% of people don't respond to that particular variable. Now you got a 60% response rate. do your multiple imputation, and see what that fraction of missing information looks like after that process. It might have gone from 60% to 30% because there's useful information in other variables that you can recover for those individuals, including your auxiliary variables. Okay, so FMI is another very useful alternative that some surveys are monitoring regularly as a measure of data quality, again, for individual estimates. It's more in line with the idea that non-response bias is a characteristic of an individual estimate. Okay, I mentioned these newer measures of non-ignorable selection bias, how a lot of the existing measures assume that non-response follows an ignorable mechanism, where once we have available auxiliary variables, we know pretty much all there is to know about the features of people who do or do not respond. Okay? This is a recently developed family of model-based measures of selection bias, and these measures of selection bias have been formulated now for means, for proportions, and for linear and probit model coefficients. So these models of selection bias are all for individual variables in a survey data collection. So these are variable specific measures. Again, consistent with the idea that non-response bias is a feature of an estimate and not an entire survey. Okay, these new measures that are introduced here allow for non-ignorable selection mechanisms. The idea that your likelihood of responding is a function of the variable that the survey is trying to measure even after you adjust for all these other observed auxiliary variables. Okay, that difficult mechanism where Y directly predicts P no matter what auxiliary information you have available. Okay, that's the kind of mechanism that these measures speak to. And sensitivity analysis is a key feature of these different measures. They give you an idea of a range of plausible values for your estimate, allowing for different potential selection mechanisms, including those that are non-ignorable. And what's nice about these measures is that there's now a variety of very easy to use R software available for computing all of these measures, again, for a given estimate. Okay, so there are papers, there are tutorials, there are presentations. They're starting to be more widely used, and they offer alternatives to R indicators and other measures like that, allowing for non-ignorable selection. That's the key difference. Okay? So the overall goal of these measures is to allow you to make inference about the amount of selection bias and whether it's non-zero. And furthermore, they allow you to adjust your estimates for that potential bias. Okay? So oftentimes we rely on weighting. We do non-response adjustment. We do post-stratification. We do calibration. These approaches also allow you to take a raw estimate and compute an adjusted estimate that corrects for that non-ignorable selection bias. Okay? That's another key advantage of these approaches. The challenge is that they're specific to a given estimate. So unlike a global weight, which folds in these non-response adjustments and post-stratification adjustments, you would have to go through the calculation of these measures for all survey estimates that you're interested in. But so far, I think the research is showing that it's worth the effort to do that. Okay, there's also the idea of considering, I mentioned weighting, trying alternative weighting strategies. So another thing Bob suggested in this 2006 article was testing the sensitivity of your estimates to different weighting strategies. So the idea of this is to compare your key estimates across multiple alternative weighting strategies. So something that's very popular nowadays is comparing logistic regression to machine learning or other kinds of AI tools for estimating response propensities that are necessary for forming those non-response adjustments. Look at what happens to your estimates. Are they really sensitive to the type of non-response adjustment performed, or the different auxiliary variables that are used in that non-response adjustment? See if it makes a difference in terms of the inferences that you're making, and see whether there seem to be changes in that inference depending on the strategy used. So that's another type of sensitivity analysis. How sensitive are your estimates to the approach that you're taking to that non-response adjustment? And then finally, I mentioned non-response follow-up. It's important to think about qualitative assessments of what led to potential non-response bias. So as I mentioned earlier, documentation is key. All the steps taken to reduce non-response bias should be noted as part of your survey documentation. So responsive survey design strategies, adaptive survey design strategies, and I say on the slide, yes, those are different things. Don't call responsive adaptive designs interchangeably. It drives our survey methodologists crazy, okay? Those are very different strategies. Active monitoring of quality indicators, I've mentioned a bunch of them during the data collection. And then case prioritization strategies, like for example, where we prioritized that particular sociodemographic subgroup during data collection, dedicating more resources to that group to try to restore more balance to the overall survey data set. And then look at your weighted estimates before and after these strategies are applied, or after an experiment has been implemented or something like that, to see what kind of impact that strategy had on the overall estimate. Was it really addressing non-response bias, or is there still something, a harder challenge operating that you need to address? Okay, so just by way of some concluding thoughts, using the response rate as an indicator of non-response bias is simply a bad idea. Hopefully I've made that point at this point. The response rate is one possible indicator of survey quality and yield, but it's not a consistent indicator of non-response bias in all the estimates that we produce based on our surveys. There are more modern approaches to measuring and reducing bias, both quantitative and qualitative, that now exist, and they're easy to implement and they're easy to document. Okay? It's also important to quantify potential non-response bias via these approaches and document the design steps that were taken to reduce it, in addition to the possible impacts of those steps. So we all know that survey response rates are declining in all different kinds of surveys, but it's important to do as much as possible from a design perspective to combat these trends and not read into lower response rates as automatic evidence of non-response bias. At the end of these slides, I've included a number of references that I've talked about throughout the different talks, so I'm happy to share electronic versions of any of these articles with you. But again, there's a lot of information out there now on these alternative techniques, and I think it's definitely high time for all of us to take advantage of these different approaches to address this problem. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And I think, yeah, we have a mic, so I can bring this around. Oh, or Catherine has it. Up, okay.
Sorry, I was going to say she was. Thank you. Oh.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, you were ahead of me. I just got the mic somehow.
I think on Zoom they can only hear the mic. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brady. That was wonderful. I agree with you completely regarding the response rate as not an indicator of non-response bias. But I had a question about your first concluding thought.
Yep.
When you say survey quality, what do you mean specifically?
Yeah, so it's part of a larger picture. Okay, so if somebody gives me a survey like recent political polls, for example, with a 1% response rate, what is that really offering, right? So the point I'm trying to make there is that the response rate is one possible indicator of quality that should be provided as part of a larger set of indicators of quality. So clearly, we want surveys with higher response rates. That's why I said HRS is really happy that we just kind of shifted this trend. It's a well-known indicator. How many eligible people did you get to participate? But it's not an end-all be-all. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Under the subject of the non-ignorable missingness and doing analyses to be able to measure the amount per estimate.
Right.
If you have a survey with a lot of estimates,
Like we all do.
Is this something where you do it by sort of section of topic, or do you pick key ones that are relevant for how do you approach that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think a good strategy for using these in practice, and this is what we've tried on a couple different surveys so far, is to just pick out a handful of key variables. I'm a big proponent of focusing on the variables that the users of our data are also focusing on. So going out in the literature and seeing, okay, what are the MTF variables? What are the HRS variables that people are writing about right now? And focusing those initial analyses of that potential selection bias on those quote unquote key variables that are not only important in our point of view, but also important to data users. I think that's a good starting point. But I agree with you. Those kinds of measures, as I noted, that's their weakness. Unlike just using a global weight with some non-response adjustment that you can just apply to every variable, you really do need to be careful about those measures for every unique estimate that you're looking at. So it's certainly a drawback, but that's why I think the computational tools that are out here now allow us to get at that to some extent.
All right, going to the data users. Excuse me, because this is important. And this is where I think we have the issues, including the quality indicator of response rates. So very concrete example, because I've had this conversation with Peter Lim, is the UK. So you guys come and say, the survey methodologists, 30% is perfectly fine. It's not unbiased. And then I say, give me the crosstabs of every single one of these demographic groups that I'm interested in. Tell me what the sample size is going to be with that 30% response rate that you're happy with. But now I have to analyze that data. And now I don't have any power to analyze that. It could be beautiful, but now I have to make inferences from this data. But the group that I'm most interested in, or the policymakers are most interested in, now don't have the sample size for me to do that. So then I say, I don't want to use this data set because it doesn't provide for me what I need. And I feel like that's the concrete issue of when people see these response rates. It's not even the response rate itself, and even though I understand what you're saying, it's the actual usable sample size for the inferences that you have to do in statistics. So what is your recommendation for that?
Right. So it's a great point, Pam. And that's why I say yield. On this first bullet point, when I talk about yield, you want a higher response rate because it just means you're getting more data. You're getting more of that sample to actually cooperate. So certainly higher yield is always better. And like somebody in Pam's shoes who's looking at subgroups, as one possible indicator of survey quality, you see a 30, 20, 10% response rate. You say, well, I know right away, I'm probably not going to have enough sample or enough power in my sample to detect certain phenomena of interest for a given subgroup. I can't argue against that. So while the general theory says that, yeah, for most estimates, you're going to be fine, the actual achieved sample size is still going to be a function of that response rate. And if it's low, you're limited in that regard in terms of statistical power. So I think in recognition of that, that's where a lot of the research that's being done right now is on integrating data sources. So not just saying, okay, we had a 25% in this one survey, but hey, we've also got this other survey that also collected similar measures or enough information that would allow us to predict key measures that we're interested in. Let's put those surveys together and come up with estimates that leverage the information from both of those surveys. There's a vast amount of work being done right now on combining different sources of data. And I think that's going to help with that particular problem. So that's. Oh yeah, no, I'm not agreeing. I'm not disagreeing at all. Yep. No. Combine it, yeah. It's again, that can be a recommendation for data users. Here's other potential data sets that collected similar measures. If you need more sample. Like I think that idea of integrating and combining alternative data sources is just going to keep becoming more and more important. For sure, that's a great point, though. I can't disagree.
Thank you for the presentation. Two-part question. The first one is, in that first paper, when we were looking at bias, what was the benchmark that the authors were using to establish that measure? And then how do we think about it when we're looking at a measure that's not numeric, like it's categorical?
Yes. Okay. So two-part question. Going back to this graph. So in that meta-analysis, for all of these different estimates, they had the true values available for that particular variable. So these were very unique studies that Bob and Amelia and others spent a great deal of time tracking down, where they actually had access to true values that would enable them to compute these measures of relative bias. So that's why that study was so impactful, was because of the time that they spent finding all those sources that had true values available. That's the first point. For categorical variables, typically what we're going to do is focus on proportions. And that's where you can say, okay, how much bias is there in these estimates of proportions, in vectors of proportions? Like that's going to be the primary focus. Now, for open-ended stuff, that's a different topic, right? So, if we're trying to conduct a survey to collect qualitative information and glean something from open-ended responses, how can we determine if there's evidence of bias in the qualitative information? That's a great dissertation topic, but that's something that more and more people are thinking about, given LLMs being used to analyze these qualitative sources of information. How do we know that we're analyzing a collection of text that's coming from a representative sample? It's a great open question. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Yeah.